Let's go ahead and get started. I'm glad to have everyone with us this morning. It looks like our number's going to be down given the weather and the circumstances with the pandemic. I guess I'm not really surprised. We're going to be in James chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 this morning. My original intent when I started breaking this down for presentation in class was to do 9 verses. So the whole chapter 3 is this maxim that we're dealing with regarding the tongue. I was going to try to do it in 2 sessions, and it's just not going to fit unless I talk super fast or, fail to go into the material to the depth that it deserves. So we're going to do 6 verses, 6 verses, 6 verses over the next 3 weeks. So before we get into our study this morning, let's pause for a moment and have a word of prayer. Father, we're grateful to you for the blessings of this day. We're grateful that you provide for us, that you provided this time for us to assemble together, and we pray your blessings on our assembly this morning. May we be edified and strengthened and encouraged by your word. We ask your blessings on our teachers as they present their lessons, and on us as hearers as we're learning what you would have us to know. Bless this congregation and its service to you. Be with our shepherds and our deacons, our preachers, those who serve in the various capacities. Help us to find ways to serve in your kingdom as well, Lord. Encourage us in this and guide us in this. We ask that you would be with our nation and continue to watch over and care for it, and help us to return to you the way that we should, so that you can bless us the way that you want to. Go with us in all things, we ask in your Son's name. Amen. I guess I have to turn it on. Yeah. So, we've broken the book of James up into a series of 9 maxims. That's a very common style of writing in Hebrew for Hebrew writers. And the first maxim opened with this: consider it all a joy when you encounter various trials, which I think is a little bit of an odd way to open a letter, but it works and it gets the point across. And why should we do that? Because trials are going to come, that's a given. But these trials will bring endurance, which in turn will make us mature and complete. So that's the goal of these things. If we're having trouble understanding all of this, ask God for wisdom. He will give generously and without reproach. The second maxim opened with the phrase, be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Really good relationship advice there, both spiritually, physically, and family members and things like that. Hear first, speak, be hesitant to speak and be hesitant for anger. Then he also tells us to receive the implanted word, which can save our souls. And the idea of an implanted word is it's transplanted into us. So it's going to live in us and give us life as well. Then he says, be doers of the word and not just hearers. Hearing's a whole lot easier than doing. Talking is a whole lot easier than doing. We're probably better at both than we are doing, but this is what we need to understand and be engaged in. Also in the second maxim, learn to bridle our tongues in James 1:26, and learn to show mercy. So James chapter 3 is him circling back around to this idea of learning to bridle our tongues. The third maxim, do not show favoritism, especially based on wealth or social standing. It's very easy to want to do this with people who are attractive or popular or wealthy or something like that. But don't do it. Don't degrade one above the other either way. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Show mercy if you want to receive mercy. This is, again, a reciprocal thing. You want to be forgiven? Learn to forgive. You want to receive mercy? Learn to show mercy. The fourth maxim is faith without works is dead. While faith and works may be distinct, they are also complementary to each other. Abraham demonstrated and completed his faith by his works. And looking at his story, he left Haran with faith and a promise. And that sustained him for some 40, 50 years before he got to the point that God says, offer Isaac as a sacrifice, this son of promise through whom I'm going to bless you and give you a multitude of descendants. And Abraham left it up to God. I don't know how you're going to fulfill the promise and take the sacrifice, but you're going to have, you'll work this out some way. And he was justified and completed by that work. Rahab, the harlot, was also saved by the works that came from her faith when she harbored the spies as they were getting ready to invade Jericho. And she was added to Israel. She's in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Okay, to get started on here, let's turn in our Bibles to James chapter 3, and I'd like a volunteer to read verses 1 through 6, please. Marnie? So looking at the passage, I've highlighted the words that I think that we're going to need to understand in order to get to James's meaning. Let not many of you become teachers. Stricter judgment, stumble, perfect, and boasts. So what do we got to say about this? The Greek word that's translated teachers in the New American Standard and the New King James Version means teacher, master, or doctor. When applied to a Jewish teacher of the law, this word would usually be translated rabbi. And in fact, if James wrote this in Greek, but if a Hebrew was to come along and translate this back into Hebrew, they probably would have put the word rabbi in this reading right here as well. When applied to a Greek, it would likely be translated master, teacher, or philosopher. And indeed, the idea of doctor, well, our PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, comes from this very idea, somebody who's thoroughly mastered this particular area of wisdom, if you will. Judgment is from the Greek word krima, which is the result of the Greek word krino, or to judge, and this is the verdict or the sentence that is the result of judgment. So, mentioned earlier, criminal trial, 2 phases. The first, we try to figure out guilty, not guilty, and if the verdict is guilty, then you go into the sentencing phase. This is the sentencing phase. This is the penalty or the judgment that's going to be rendered based upon the verdict. Stumble in the New American Standard means to stumble or to cause to stumble. So sometimes we stumble. Sometimes we cause somebody else to stumble. This word covers both occurrences of that. Perfect is the same Greek word that James has used repeatedly, and it means mature and complete. The word boasts, that's translated boast in the New American Standard, is from a Greek word that means to lift up the neck. And I think what they're talking about there is when somebody's boasting about themselves or something like that, we typically do a little bit of posturing, try to look big and manly and puffy or something like that, or, if you're a woman, maybe try to look a little extra feminine or something like that. But we all have little posture things that we're going through when we're starting to tell you how wonderful we are. That's what that's talking about. So what does that mean? Let not many of you become teachers or masters or teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we will receive a stricter judgment, basically a stricter verdict or sentence. For we all stumble or cause to stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is perfect, again, mature and complete. He is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, if we put bits into the horse's mouth so that they may obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Behold, the ships also, though they are so great and are driven by strong winds, are still directed by a very small rudder wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. So the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts, lifts up the neck of great things. Behold, how great a forest fire is set aflame by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and is set on fire by hell. This is some pretty strong words about a very small part of the body. So in this maxim, James is going to focus on the use of the tongue. And his first admonition on this topic is, let not many of you become teachers. Or the King James Version translates it, masters. Now this again is one of those things that's kind of unusual, like opening the letter with the first thing out as count it a joy when you encounter various trials. We're going to talk about the tongue, and the first thing he talks about is teachers. Well, teaching shows up in this discussion because it involves a lot of talking or writing, which is basically talking with your fingers. But in other words, you're a focal point. You're supposed to be looking at me right now. Most of you are, and my job is to make sure that you don't fall asleep, and sometimes that happens anyway because I'm not very good at this sometimes. But focal point. There's a temptation that goes with that. Be not many seems strange given the number of times teaching is mentioned as a function of the church in the New Testament. In the New American Standard Version, teach is mentioned 37 times, teacher is mentioned 52 times. Of those times, in both words, most of the time, those words occur in the gospel accounts. Most of the time, it's a reference to something Christ is doing. When they're talking about a teacher, they're usually talking about Christ in the Gospels. When they're talking about teach, that's what Christ is the one who does the most of in the gospel accounts. So it's a word that's used fairly commonly in the New Testament. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 13, and he gave some as apostles and some as prophets and some as evangelists and some as pastors and some as teachers for the equipping of the saints for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ until we all attain the unity of the faith and to the knowledge of the Son of God, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. So we have a clear mandate in Scripture that the church needs teachers. One of 5 roles responsible for these particular activities of building up the church and encouraging and equipping the saints for the work of the service. So that's our mandate. In the context of this letter, James is referring to a teacher in the Jewish sense of the word rabbi, or the Greek sense of the word philosopher. Jews in the first century held the position of rabbi in very high esteem. In fact, if you wanted to make it as a Pharisee, one of the things you wanted to do was to become a rabbi and have your own synagogue or your own school or what have you, because the rabbi exercised authority over the entire congregation or the entire group, and that usually came with benefits. Similarly, the Greeks had a similar role of itinerant philosopher who traveled from town to town teaching their philosophy with the intent of making a living from their teaching. If you recall, in the book of Acts, when he was on his second missionary journey and he was having trouble landing at a spot, not getting driven out of town, he eventually wound up at the Greek city of Athens. And do you remember how Luke describes it, Athens? This was the place where everybody came to talk about new things. New ideas, new things. It was kind of like the intellectual capital, if you will, of the Roman Empire. That's a very Greek thing to do. And fame as a philosopher brought other benefits as well. So when you talk about famous philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Zeno, the Stoic, Epicurus, all of these types of people, they would be the master teacher. And that's what James is talking about here. In Matthew 28, 1 through 8, Jesus discusses this desire for Pharisees and Jews in general to be called rabbi, and he criticizes the Pharisees for wanting this title, and he tells his disciples, don't go after this title. You don't need to be called this. James is not saying here, don't any of you be teachers. What he is warning is against the misuse of the role or desiring the role for selfish reasons. Again, there's a temptation that can come up with being in front of an audience. If I want to do self-promotion, I have now the forum and the platform to do that. And if I do it very much, you guys are going to get really irritated, and justifiably so. So we won't go down that path. But that's, if you want to build a following, sometimes you have to take something public like that and go with it. Famous places where this happens in our day. Televangelists. Wouldn't it be nice to have a congregation of 20,000 people and all of those people giving generously to the cause and me being able to make a pretty good living off of that? A lot of people who set out to do that don't make it. Politicians. There's been at least one case in the last 20 years where somebody spent more on a Senate seat, U.S. Senate seat run, than he could ever accumulate from getting paid for being a senator. Like millions of dollars of his own money running for the Senate. Why did he do that? Maybe he wanted to serve, or maybe he realized that I could leverage that into other things as well, because it's a very powerful position. So teaching is probably not the best choice to do that, but it is not, it's not an uncommon choice either. So, any questions or comments? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And mm-hmm. Famous for having air conditioned their doghouse, you know, which I guess, in North Carolina, you can kind of see that, but who can afford that? Now, and it's also interesting to see how that turned out, isn't it? When it finally got scammed, he got to prison, she dumped him like a hot potato. Yeah. So were they really in it for, the right reason? Well, no, they weren't. Everybody sins. This is a universal truth of the human condition. We have all stumbled, or in some cases caused someone else to stumble. Sins of the tongue are among the most common and, at the same time, the most difficult to avoid. Any person, James is telling us, any person who could avoid sinning by what they say would be a very remarkable person indeed. James refers to this person as perfect or mature and complete. Now, one of the interesting things about the use of the tongue is very often we show the contents of our heart and give indications of what we're going to do by the things that we say. So if I were to pick out a random audience member here and walk up and smack them upside the head, you would be very surprised. I would be very surprised. But to do such a thing without having said anything about it is, there's no, he snapped, she went nuts or, lost her way or something like that, but they snapped or something like that. If, on the other hand, I were to pick a member of the audience and say some nasty things or accusatory things about them and then go up and smack them upside the head, well, now you can see it coming. But why? Because the words revealed the intent. So I'm not going to say anything nasty about anybody. I'm not interested in smacking anybody in the head, because most of you are way younger than I am and could beat the daylights out of me, so not a good combination. Typically, we do give indication of that by what we say. So in addition to sinning, we're foreshadowing, if you will, our own behavior. And not doing this makes us more mature and complete. Verse 3 is a simple illustration. One controls a horse by controlling its mouth. Now, I want to point out I am not knowledgeable about horses. I have done some horseback riding a time or two, but I don't know a whole lot about this. So if you know something better than what I'm about to tell you, please correct me on this. A horse's bit sets in the mouth across the jaws in a gap between its teeth. So you have the stirrups that come off the bit, and that has the reins, and when the horse is moving, you turn it by pulling the reins to the left if you want it to go left, right if you want it to go right, and the horse turns its head in that direction and moves in that direction to relieve the pressure on the jaws and the teeth from the bit. So you've got this little piece of metal about that long, some leather straps and things like that, and you're controlling an animal that weighs hundreds of pounds with doing this. Now, this system works fine until the horse manages to clench the bit between its teeth. I think they refer to that as spitting the bit. So it gets out of the gap and they can hold it in their teeth. And all of a sudden, you're no longer in charge of the horse because the bit's not in the place where it needs to be, and the horse will go where it wants to go. I went to high school in northern New Mexico. At the congregation I went to at Los Alamos, there was a couple there that were running the Seven Springs Fish Hatchery west of Los Alamos. Lovely place, loved the people, loved going up there. They had a couple of horses, and one Saturday, my brother and I, Dan, were up there riding horses, and the horses were smart horses. They knew these guys are rookies. And so Dan's horse, I think it was, managed to spit the bit and then clench it. And he and I saw portions of the Jemez Mountains that day that were not on our horseback riding agenda. Let's just say it that way. I mean, it went where it wanted to go, and we didn't have a whole lot of control about it. So it was very frustrating for him and I both. And James further illustrates this using ships. Compared to its rudder, a ship with sails is huge. And there's a massive amount of force being generated by collecting the wind in the sails and moving this ship along. The sails gather the energy, and you can move this huge vessel across the ocean and steer it with this little tiny rudder. Now, ancient rudders were not the way they are on modern ships today. They're not mounted in the middle of the stern or the back of the ship. They were actually on the right side, and what it was a big board like that. And so what you had is you had a lever that came out this way, and if you wanted to steer the ship, you pushed it that way, and it would steer towards the right, or if you pulled it this way, it would steer towards the left. I thought maybe I got that wrong. So it wasn't back there. The board was actually known as a steer board, not a rudder at that particular time. It's just a big board that you steer it with. And so the right side of the ship became known as the steer board or starboard side. Now, ships with this type of rudder typically docked along the left side so that you would keep the rudder free and not beat it up against the wharf or the dock that you were up against there. And so the left side of the ship became known as the port side. So there's your little nautical lesson for today, completely free. Starboard, port. So just like a horse's bit is small compared to the horse, or a ship's rudder is small compared to the ship, the tongue is small when compared to the human body. I will guarantee you, for every adult in this auditorium, that the weight of your tongue, my tongue, is well under 1% of the mass of our bodies. Little tiny thing sitting in there in the mouth, doesn't weigh very much, but boy, does this thing punch above its weight. James specifically mentions in verse 5, characterizes the tongue as boasts great things, or in essence, self-glory. The tongue also punches above its weight class. A forest fire can happen as a result of a single match, cigarette butt, spark, or lightning strike. I heard on the news this week that a lot of the forest fires in California originated by electrical arcs across power lines and things like that. You've got a huge amount of electricity going through these high voltage power lines there, and it doesn't take a whole lot of disturbance really to get that thing to arc. That's why they're all the way up in the air and spaced so far apart, is so that they don't do this. So what happens as a result of that spark? We burned hundreds of thousands of acres in California. Very common in out west in very dry seasons or drought years that something like this is going to happen. So even from this small spark, thousands of acres are done. Verse 6 is a hyperbole or an exaggeration to emphasize a particular aspect or quality. I love exaggerations and I love hyperboles. He says that the tongue is a fire, and it's literally in the Greek a cosmos or a universe of iniquity. Cosmos is the Greek word that describes the entire physical universe. So this is big territory that he's talking about here. The tongue has the power to lead our entire being into sin. Again, we typically broadcast our intent, what we're going to do, who we are, by the things that we say. The phrase that's translated the course of life by the New American Standard is literally the wheel of birth. So what you say can affect the outcome or the direction of your life. You can change directions by what you say. That's a very good thing, isn't it? It also can be a very bad thing depending upon what it is that you say. The phrase that the New American Standard translates set on fire by hell, the hell in that passage is the Greek word Gehenna. This is the only place in the Gehenna is used outside of the Gospels. Used frequently in the Gospels, and it's not used any place else in the New Testament but this particular passage. It could refer to the eternal destiny or indicate a source of power where our tongue is engaged in boasting or sinning. So either he's referring to the fact that the tongue has the ability to steer us into hell, or that it's being powered by hell. And I don't see those two things as being mutually exclusive. Now, typically, when we're going to start doing something sinful with our tongues, there's some temptation or something behind that action, and this is where we're going to wind up at if we don't, make the proper corrective action. Questions or comments? So, teachers can shape eternity. Teachers are supposed to be able to shape eternity, and that's not exclusive to the role of teacher. It is a primary function of teachers. When you look at the other roles that he mentioned in there, shepherds, preachers, these kinds of things there, they have other functions that go in their particular thing in addition to teaching, and teachers is pretty much, that's what you do as a teacher in the church. When the ability is misused, it can do enormous harm. When it's used properly, it can do enormous good. No one should become a Bible teacher without understanding this principle. Your job as a Bible class teacher is to equip the saints for the work of service, to educate them and nurture them in the path that they should walk down. And you need to do that with that in mind, and you need to understand that you're going to impact people whether you realize it or not in doing so. So try to make the impact for good. One should also understand that a teacher shoulders a large burden and will be judged by how they handle that burden. And I don't think James is so much worried about a teacher getting up here and making a mistake. I mean, we're all human beings here. I blew a scripture earlier in this particular class. Gene pointed it out. I appreciate that when I do something like that and you come back and tell me about it and I can correct it. That's not a big deal. We're all going to do that. What he is worried about is the misuse of this thing, as why am I up here? I will tell you this much. If you're going to teach for the attention, if you're going to teach properly, this is a zero-sum operation. I put enough time into every class that I prepare during the week and then other study and things like that, that if I was doing it for the attention, I need to find a better plan, you know. And I'll tell you a much simpler plan: do or say something stupid. You know, you'll get all kinds of attention from that. Now, you have to be comfortable with the idea that any attention is good attention, you know. And one of the advantages of doing or saying something stupid in a congregation is I can apologize for it, and you are more likely perhaps to forgive than maybe people who are not Christians. But a much easier plan. It doesn't take a whole lot of work to do that. If you're doing the teaching for that, find another plan. The purpose for teaching is to equip the church for its mission and its growth. That's our job. When misused, the role of the teacher can be destructive or self-serving, and this must be avoided. It's not about me. It's about you. It's about the message. Sins of the tongue are among the most common and at the same time the most difficult to avoid. Is there anybody in here who's never said anything harmful or hurtful to somebody else, or, you know, on the spur of the moment without thinking? Yeah, I didn't expect to see any hands go up on that, because that's a very common human experience there, and he's telling us, you know, let's try not to go down that route. When misused, the role of teacher can be destructive or self-serving. Avoiding that, I already said that, didn't I? James says that any person who could avoid sinning by what they say would be a very remarkable person indeed. Trying not to do harm with the tongue, the only way that I could say that you could do that, maybe, is not say anything at all. And in practical terms, that's not possible. You know, we have to communicate. We have to be able to observe, to enlighten, to inform, and these kinds of things just in daily life, and so that's not really going to be very possible. But James does refer to this remarkable individual who's controlling their tongue perfectly as perfect, fully grown and mature. And I think also one of the aspects of that is if we could actually really do that, a lot of the other things that follow up with that, so that when we say harmful things about other people that we shouldn't be saying, we don't build the animosity necessarily to go in and ramp this effort up and repeat it or do something far worse. Yes?
Doesn't that go with the slow to speak?
Yes, exactly.
If you're going to be a teacher in a way, not in a slow to speak way, but you say you put hours and hours into repeating study. You're not quickly jumping in and saying what comes to your mind. You're going into the word, you're analyzing it, you're speaking it from the standpoint of you were slow to getting there, and you're coming into knowledge at that point.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. I don't always do that perfectly. I don't think any teacher does, but that's the goal. Exactly. Other questions or comments? Yes. That is a good point.
So I think that as we grow into Christ, that we should be doing a little bit better with our tongue, because we're getting mature, and that whatever the gift is in our lives, it is having dominance in our lives and our tongue.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah, we can't, God can tame the tongue. And, yes?
I don't want to belabor the obvious, but we think about controlling the tongue, things that we say, but many times what we don't say is just as important as what we do say.
That is true.
So part of that control is knowing when to speak and when not to speak, and what kind of things we should say.
Yeah, that's back to that slow to speak thing here. As I speak, make sure brain and heart is engaged before mouth is open, type of a thing. Anything else? When used correctly, the tongue can instruct, encourage, correct, build up, and be a blessing to those around you. Now, pause for a moment and think about this. How many of you have had people in your life who have encouraged you or benefited you or guided you in some way by something that they said to you, often more than one time? How do you remember those people? They were valuable, weren't they? So what we say has the power to do that for others. Do not neglect catching people doing something right and telling them about it. Don't neglect it. I think one of the things that I learned as coaching kids soccer was tell them when they did something right. And it was simply a matter of, if you want them to do this again, I mean, they might not even be aware of anything they've done. If you want them to repeat this behavior and grow from it, acknowledge the fact that they did it. That's a good sense of reinforcement for children, and guess what? It works for adults too. So, don't neglect to do that. When used incorrectly, the tongue is a universe of iniquity. It can demean, degrade, incite, humiliate, ignite, or destroy others. You can ruin relationships by what you say. And in fact, in most of the abusive relationships, when they're talking about people being abused and things like that, the tongue is always a big part of that thing, and it benefits from repetition. So it isn't enough to just to say, I hate you, you're disgusting, you're ugly, or any of these other hateful things. Say them repeatedly. And you can destroy somebody's self-esteem. And I would suggest, or probably most of us have had experience being around somebody like that, hopefully not a victim of somebody like that, but we've seen this in some other people, and so there's your lesson of don't do this. How do you remember those people? The people that encouraged us and helped us to grow and develop, even when they were telling us that we were doing something wrong and needed to correct it, we can remember them fondly. The people that were destructive to us or to other people and things like that, it's like, I don't want to be around people like that. They're not helpful at all. So that's an element of the tongue that we need to keep in mind as well. What we say can influence both our destiny and the destiny of others. I think in the process of encouraging somebody else and acknowledging that they've done something good, this sister, she's a really good servant of Christ in this particular area, that teaches me to look at you differently. Now I see you as valuable. If I'm looking for the negative, I see you as an obstacle or a threat or something less than what you are. And the other thing about it is, if you understand that I see you as valuable, and I have to sit down and have a little talk with you about something that you may be doing that's not good or not healthy or not right, I have more credibility if I've already acknowledged that you're a valuable human being and that I care about you and you do a good service, and now I'm here to help you do it better. That's a different form of correction, other than the fact that if you weren't such a flaming idiot, you wouldn't have done that to start with. So, the words do matter. The tongue is a fire and a cosmos of iniquity. It has the ability to set the world on fire. It's also a little rudder that can steer us into sin, or it can steer us into heaven. Just all depends upon how we're going to use it. Okay, any questions or comments? Yes?
I react to the tone of the voice as well as the words. That's very important.
Yes, and that's actually a major problem with social media, isn't it? Is in social media, that's just words on a page. And I don't know, were you being funny? Were you being amusing? Were you being critical? Or, I don't see the body language that goes with that particular statement, because I'm like you. So when you're doing something like that, that's one of the reasons you want to do it in person, right? When you're talking to somebody, you need to get to know them in person, because you're missing out on half the conversation at least, because you don't see those things. Other questions or comments? This is the first time this year that I've been early on class. So. Wasn't a really high bar, was it? So I appreciate your attention and your comments, and we'll get into this a little bit more in our next session. Thank you very much.